scary, but thank you all for joining again today in our live webinar. Risk management planning is on the agenda today. Not often the sexiest topic for us to talk about in events, but absolutely essential. So hopefully what we share with you today will just make this whole process smoother and efficient, so that you can put your time and energy into the more creative aspects of event planning. So today we've got, as I said, oh, sorry, my button's not working. There we go. Risk management. That then takes us to halfway through our live series. So then we've got next week, we'll look at emergency management planning, which is essentially a bit of an extension of risk management planning. So those two actually go somewhat together, but we'll focus more on, emergency crisis evacuation, some of that scarier stuff that we often don't like to think about, but once again is also really essential. And then our last two sessions, we look at marketing and social media, and then we're looking at event teams and succession planning. So once again, another couple of really important topics. As you know, if you've been listening in on our live webinars, we also have a series of pre-recorded bite-sized webinars. So as soon as they're recorded and ready, they'll be made available to you as well. They'll be just a little 10-15 minute as I said, bite-sized sessions on topics such as accessible events. We'll also do one on the public events framework, so around COVID planning. We're going to do one on site planning and also the new state government event planner tool. So they'll be made available to you along with the recordings of all of the live sessions. So once again, today I will do my best to stick to 1 hour maximum with some question time. So if you've got anything that you would like to discuss or raise or dive a little bit deeper into, please pop it into the chat box at any point. I'll ask everybody just to stay on mute as I just present the content for you. It just makes it a lot cleaner when we're recording it. And then, as I said, pop any questions or anything into the chat box, and I'll be sure to address those when we get to our discussion time at the end. And if you've got any other points that you'd like to discuss, then that will be a great time to raise them as well. Now, just quickly, in a quick introduction, I'm Linda Tillman. I'm the Managing Director of Tilma Group and Regional Events Academy. At Regional Events Academy, we deliver programs like this for events across all parts of regional Australia, and it's really about trying to streamline and enhance the efficiencies of organising events, particularly for volunteer event committees that are working really hard in regional communities to do great things. So we do a lot of training, we do a lot of webinars, we've got online courses, and we also do some one-on-one coaching as well. And in Tilma Group, we do a lot more of the strategic planning aspect. But you can check us out online if you're curious to understand a little bit more about what we do. Now today, as I said, risk management is our topic today. And those of you that have joined us in previous webinars will know that each of our live webinars also come with a supporting resource that will help you implement the operational process that we're talking about. The event risk management plan template that you'll receive is already pre-populated with some standard risks that you should be considering for your event, but it's also designed for you to tailor and customize based on the risks associated with your event and the unique aspects of your event. So what I'm going to cover off in the next 40 minutes or so is around defining risks and what risks actually are. We're going to look at simple steps to effective risk management. So that's really taking the key elements of that event management plan template and giving you just an overview of how to actually use that and the key aspects around creating a really robust risk management plan, because I don't want you to just think of risk management planning being, you know, a painful process that you just want to get ticked off the list. It's actually a really important process to invest time and energy into. So I'm going to talk you through how to do that. And like a lot of these operational processes that we're talking about in this series, once you actually do it well once, so once you've created the risk management plan for your event and you've got a comprehensive plan, that becomes a really good resource for future years as well. Yes, there will be changes that will need to be made each year, but you won't need to create the whole document again. So just remember that it's not something you have to do in great detail every year. We're also going to look at some contingency planning as well. We're not going to focus a lot on COVID, although COVID-19 is a big risk for a lot of events at the moment. Well, not really, because we can't even run events, but it's one of the big health and safety factors for us as we're looking to plan future events. I'm not going to focus on that because, as I said, one of our bite-sized seminars or webinars is actually on the COVIDsafe planning framework for Victoria. So that one is to come, although we do acknowledge that COVID is obviously a key health and safety risk. One of the things I just want you to think about when I talk about risk management, or when you think about risk management for your event, it's really important to think about how you can manage risk without impacting on the event experience. And that's often the challenge with risk management, is we need to create a healthy and safe environment for people to enjoy our event without actually impacting on the event experience. So it's not about, you know, shutting everything down if it's deemed a tiny bit risky, because that's going to impact on the event experience. You know what it's like. Sometimes some of the more riskier things create the best experience. So it's about getting that balance, and it's about acknowledging the risk and putting in place mitigation strategies to manage the risk. So it's really important just to remember, you don't want to be so, it's really hard thinking about how to word this because risk management is absolutely critical. But I just want you to remember that you've also got to create a great event experience. And that's where sometimes it's really helpful to bring on board some experts that work in risk management, because sometimes they can actually provide, you know, mitigation strategies that would allow you to do things that you think you shouldn't be doing because it's too risky. You know, sometimes it can be really scary when we think about all the things that can go wrong when we are looking at our event. But what we need to remember as well is that we're managing risk every day in our lives. So don't overthink it too much. You know, whenever we step outside the door, you know, we are managing risk in our daily life. And if you've got young kids like myself, you'll know they'll always push the boundaries. And as a mother, you need to always be managing risk without impacting on the experience for our kids. So it's no different to that. It's really important to get that balance right, because we want to make sure that we continue to offer great experiences at our events. All right, now identifying risk. There are so many different types of risk to take into consideration, and I'm not going to share this really long list with you to scare you. I'm going to share this really long list with you to get you thinking, because one of the key things with risk management is identifying the risk and developing the list of potential things that could go wrong at your event. And one of the really key elements of that is that it's more than health and safety. Often when we think about risk with our events, we immediately go to health and safety. How do we make sure that we manage the health and safety of our staff, of our volunteers, of our attendees, of our contractors, etc.? But there's so many other risks for us to consider when we're doing our risk management planning. I'd love everyone to just think about their own event for a moment and think about what would be the top 3 risks associated with your event. And share it in the chat box, because I'll be really curious to circle back to this once I've talked you through these 6 different types of risks for your event. So what are the 3 top risks, or the 3 key risks? What are the highest risks associated with your event? Pop it into the chat box and see what everybody pops in there. For me, risk management plans are one of the most important planning tools for your event. So, you know, when we have a strategic business plan, we have our planning timeline, we usually have a marketing schedule. For me, the risk management plan sits alongside those documents because it actually helps guide decision-making and planning. Once we know what risks can happen and we've got mitigation strategies in place, you actually feel more confident. It's the unknown that's quite scary. And I think we can all appreciate that, you know, today when we're dealing with uncertainty. That's the hard part. So if we can identify what they are, identify how we will deal with them, it actually becomes a little bit easier to manage. So the first thing you need to do when you're developing the risk management plan is to just sit down. If you've got a team, sit down with your team, with your committee, with other fellow volunteers, and just brainstorm what are all of the potential risks associated with your event. And I want you to think about more than health and safety. You need to think about risks that could cause injury to an attendee or participant. So yes, health and safety. You need to think about risks that can cause damage to equipment, damage to infrastructure, damage to the event site, that can impact the environment or community. We talked about responsible events last week. You know, are there any risks in terms of environmental impact or, you know, community impact? They need to be factored in. And you also need to consider things that could harm the future of the event or the organising committee. So they're things like financial risks and legal risks, human resource risks. Essentially, what you want to do when you're doing this brainstorming is to ask as many what if questions as you can. What if we lost power supply? What if key managers were sick on the day? What if we had a bushfire? What if our major sponsor pulled out? What if we didn't get that grant funding that we were really dependent upon? What if our main artist doesn't turn up or pulls out at the last minute? So it's all of these what if questions, which can sometimes be overwhelming. I mean, when you sit down and start to think about all the things that can go wrong, you almost want to run. But like I said before, once you identify them, you think through, just logically think through. It's all it is. It's really not rocket science. It's simply just thinking through in a logical way how you would manage it. So let's just have a quick look at some of the different types of risks. So first of all, as I said, this is often our go-to, is our health and safety, and that's of our event attendees, and also our suppliers, our volunteers, anybody that comes on site. And this is a really big priority for us as event organisers. And one of the things we often forget is the health and safety of our volunteers, particularly during pack down. I don't know the stats off the top of my head, but I remember talking to a gentleman that works in risk management around events, and he told me one of, or the most common stage of an event that results in health and safety accident or injury is in the pack down. Whether that's volunteers, whether that's, you know, third-party providers packing up, whatever it is, because everyone's fatigued. And you know what it's like, you just want to pack up as quick as you can and be done. That's when accidents happen. So it's really important to remember that, to think about how you're managing that. Because I often say to people, a way to get around that, a way to mitigate any kind of injury or accident in the pack down of your event, is to have a fresh team that just does the pack down. And I know we don't all have the luxury of just pulling in a fresh team, but if you can manage that, then that's going to reduce the risk around that. All right, so what are some of the health and safety risks? So these are ones that would be fairly obvious to you. I mean, if you have an event in the outdoors, which a lot of us do, then you've obviously got hazards like snakes. I've had plenty of those at events. It's always a fun scenario. Falling tree limbs in camp areas, especially in regional events. And then you have dust, you've got sun, you know, people having getting sunstroke. There's so many different things to consider in terms of the outdoors. Other things, like I said, volunteer injury, particularly during setup and pack down. There's also the risk of escalating security and public safety costs. So that also, I guess, carries over somewhat to a financial risk. Overcrowding, natural disasters like fire, flood, excessive heat, and we'll touch on those more, particularly next week when we look at emergency management. You've got accidents around pedestrian traffic, and we talked a lot about that last week, you know, in terms of managing traffic flows, pedestrian flows, etc. That is a key risk that most events have to deal with. And then, of course, we have the fun ones, terrorism and COVID, which are new risks in recent years around health and safety. Now, environmental risks is the other category. So we talked a lot about this last week when we talked about responsible events. And I guess one thing, particularly you guys in Victoria would be quite familiar with, is bushfires. You know, that's something that's becoming quite important in terms of managing risk, and also around contingency planning for events in regional Australia. We have code red days. You know, pre-COVID, it was probably one of the biggest risks for events, particularly in regional Victoria. And the second to this is weather. You know, if it's not a fire, then we have cold, rainy days. And that's equally a big risk that can result in low attendance at your event, if not cancellation. So thinking about the weather and the natural disasters is an important environmental risk. The other thing, I guess, yeah, and we did talk about this last week when we talked about responsible events, is this whole thing around sustainable development. You know, it's more important than ever that you as event managers really appreciate the diverse impacts that events can have on the environment, and to think about how you can be more sustainable in the delivery of your event. So you want to make sure that you're not putting any harm or that there's no risk to the environment associated with your event. And if so, how do you actually handle that? You also want to think about things like excessive litter and waste, so contamination of water courses, you know, unnecessary energy usage, pollution, placing pressure on water-stressed communities. I was actually involved in an event a few years ago where this was really important, and it's not something that comes up all the time, but I guess when you think about, you know, regional events and particularly drought, you know, it is quite an important issue. And the event I worked on was an equine event. It was an international sporting event that involved hundreds of horses coming into southern Queensland, and it was at a time, you may have heard in the news, some towns, one particular called Stanthorpe in southern New South Wales in the Southern Downs, was almost out of water. Well, this event was in that regional council area, but in Warwick. And the lead up, that was all happening in the lead up to an international sporting event with hundreds of horses. So there was a lot of, I guess, you know, risk management around the use of water on that already stressed community. When you've got horses that need water, they need water to drink, to be hosed down. You've got hundreds of campers also coming in for that event. You know, it was really important in terms of how that event actually managed that potential risk, and they did a really good job of managing it. Thankfully, the heaven opened, and that was really helpful as well. And Community license. And once again, we talked about that with responsible events. So that's where, you know, you're considering any kind of impact that your event could have on your community, whether that be around, you know, noise or excess traffic or any of those risks that could actually lead to any impact on your community or local residents is really important. The third one is financial risks. So these are things now that events don't often think about when they start to do a risk management plan, but these are things that can have a long-term impact on the event, because without, you know, a financial budget, then the event can't exist into the future. So this is all around that risk of loss of finances or those unexpected costs which come up often with events. So you need to factor this in when you're looking at your risk management planning. What do you do if you do have a loss of income due to reduced ticket sales or poor attendance? You don't reach your target. Is there a way to mitigate that? Is there a way to manage that? You know, there's budgeting risks, spending money you don't have yet. There's risk around state, local government actually changing their priorities and maybe not offering funding programs that they've offered in the past. So once again, if you're dependent on those, then that's going to be a big risk to your event. So you need to mitigate that. Don't be so dependent on it. You know, under budgeting or overspending in the final stages. And I've seen this a lot in my time where you get so stressed and just need to make whatever happen in those final weeks or days that you'll just go buy that extra power cord, or you'll just, you know, give an extra $100 to somebody for a donation, or whatever you have to do to make the event happen. And it's all of those little costs that actually add up and that can result in overspending. So just considering how you manage that before you get to that stress stage is really important. And another risk from a financial perspective is if you do lose a major sponsor. You know, if you've had a major sponsor for a period of time and you really, you know, rely on that injection for your event, what happens if you lose it? Another example, actually right now I'm working on doing a strategic business plan for an event, and the volunteer coordinator phoned me yesterday evening and she said, council have changed how they're distributing the arts funding. And they use their arts funding. They were getting something like $30,000 a year, and they were using that whole fund to engage all of their artists for their jazz festival. Now they can only get 10,000 maximum. So they've phoned me and said, okay, from a business planning perspective, we need to somehow look at how we recover $20,000 a year. How are we going to do that? So things like this can happen that's outside of your control, but you need to be thinking about these things if it's a risk to your event. If you're not completely financial yet, then something like that can have a big impact. The other category to consider are technology risks. So these are things like your comms can fail due to excessive mobile phone and data usage. And this has happened many of times. So, you know, you all of a sudden in a small town, you've got 10,000 people and they all want to be on social media and ringing their friends and you know, bragging about being at your event, and the whole network drops out. So once again, thinking about that in advance, do you need boosters? How do you actually deal with that? Another risk is having unauthorized airspace intrusion, so drones over the event site. There can be spam and scams that can go out under the brand of your event. You know, need to be mindful of that and have in place mitigation strategies, you know, all of the security protection for your online systems. Ticketing system failure. You imagine you're about to open tickets. It's the day of ticket sales opening. For some reason, the whole system fails and people aren't able to purchase tickets. You can have viruses, and there's also risk around social media, brand reputation damage, etc. Just a couple more. So human resource risks, and this is really important when we're talking about events that are really dependent on us. They're really dependent on humans, on people to actually do the planning and delivery. If we lose any key personnel in the lead up to our event, it can have a massive impact. And that's why one of our sessions is going to be about, managing event teams and succession planning, because it is so important. Volunteer management, recruiting volunteers, having enough volunteers, maintaining the necessary level of volunteers. What happens if you've got a roster of volunteers and think, yes, I've filled all the spots and 25% of them don't show up? We just had the Toowoomba Carnival of Flowers in my local town, and I remember seeing posts constantly. I volunteered a number of shifts, and I remember seeing posts constantly saying, can anyone else help out? We have had 10 volunteers no show. It happens all the time, and you may have experienced that yourself. So how do you manage that? You need to be able to manage time. So poor time management and timeline blowouts leads to unnecessary stress. Lack of innovation and inspiration. So when you've got a team that gets really tired, all they can manage to deliver is the same as last year, there's risk around the success of your event. So how do you overcome that? And then, as I mentioned before, your headline act, maybe a key speaker or a key element of your event either doesn't show up, they might be late, or even worse, they may show up and they're actually really bad, really poor quality. Once again, thinking about how you would deal with that situation, or ideally prevent it from happening. And the final category of risk is marketing risk. So none of us want that reputational damage. We live in a world now where it only takes 1 second for someone to post something negative. And then it's viral. It's out there for everybody to see. So we have to be so careful. We have to know how to manage negative social media and negative reviews. If we do get poor feedback for some reason, we want to make sure that that doesn't impact on future years. Another marketing risk is the ability to secure headline talent when we've got such a competitive and saturated market. And this is going to be even more important as we start to come out of these COVID restrictions and lockdown, is because everyone's going to want to have these artists at their events. How do you make yours different? Sorry, someone just dropped out and back in. Lack of promotion or targeting the wrong markets can be a risk as well. So there's lots of marketing risks also associated with your event. So you can see there's lots of things to consider. So when you're having that brainstorm, when you're looking at identifying what the potential risks are for your event, think about all of the things that could happen. Think about all of these categories. And once you've got feedback from your team on all of these potential risks, you need to go through them again and see if you've missed anything. The whole objective of doing this is to make sure you don't have any surprises on the event day. It's so much harder to deal with this kind of thing when it happens and you're not ready or it's unexpected. But if you've had the time to think about it, when you've got that clarity of thinking, it makes it easier to deal with when you're in that peak stress moment. So now that I've shared with you a whole heap of examples, and these are just some, just to get you thinking, maybe you need to go back into the chat box and just think about what your other risks are. See if you want to add any more. It may have prompted some other thoughts for you. All right. Now, the most important part, once we've identified all of those potential risks, one of the most important parts of creating the risk management plan is that you can reduce possible risks as much as possible. And like I said, you've thought about what you need to do in the event of an emergency during the event. Well, you've got that clear mind. That's the whole idea of it. You don't want to be in the event and something happens unexpected and you're just totally frazzled, can't deal with it, it's too much, because the impact of that on the future of your event is going to be tremendous. So your risk management plan, as I said, you've got a great template coming your way. It identifies all the risks that could arise. So you've identified the risks, and then it looks at how you can either avoid them, reduce them, or mitigate them, so that you don't have any serious consequences for your event. You don't want to have financial loss. You don't want to have any impact on your brand and reputation. And you definitely don't want any legal action. So that's the whole purpose of doing this and doing this well. What I recommend to events is that you actually assign one person, or at least one person, on your committee or your team to be responsible for the risk management. And that's a big ask for someone to be responsible for risk management. It doesn't mean they are completely the sole person responsible. The whole team's responsible, but they're going to take the lead on making sure the planning component is done well. So you have a risk coordinator. Some events also outsource this, so it depends on the size and scale and the level of risk associated with your event. But there are companies that actually just do risk management for events, so you can outsource it if that makes you feel a little more comfortable. But if you're a smaller community event, then that may not be necessary for you to do that. And don't forget, you've got the team at council to actually assist you. So once you've got the template and you start through the process, it's always handy just to have someone with fresh eyes have some input into that as well. And also emergency services. And I don't want to add extra pressure onto our valuable assets, but you know, often having a conversation and a meeting with emergency services can also help identify any potential risks around your event. The other key thing to remember is that it's really important to train and brief all of your volunteers or your team in your risk management plan. You want to make sure that everybody is aware of how to manage the health, safety, and risks associated with your event. All right, so what are the 4 simple steps? Because it is quite simple. Like I said before, it's not rocket science. It's just a process of thinking it through really logically. So we've already covered step 1, identifying the risk. As I said, having that brainstorm, thinking about all those different types of risks that I talked about. You know, it can just be like scribbling them all down. And then we start to look a little bit closer. So we dive into step 2 and 3. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about those now. But before I do, I just wanted to note, step 4 is not something you typically see in event risk management planning, but I like to add it in because I'm a big fan of post-event. We can learn so much if we actually do a really thorough post-event review. Typically, post-event review is looking at, you know, doing surveys, debriefs, etc. But I just want to make sure that when you're doing that, you also consider a debrief or a review on how well your risk management plan worked. There might be things that came up that weren't considered in the risk management plan, so you want to go and adjust that. There may be things that, you know, in your risk management plan that you think, you know what, that's not going to be a risk for us moving forward now that we've really thought about it. So make sure you actually undertake that review at the end of your event, and that's a good time to actually update your plan for the following year. All right. So people often look at this matrix and like go, what the heck? What is this? You know, it does look a little bit confusing when you look at it, but when you know how it works, it's a really cool tool. So basically what you're trying to do here is to work out, so each of those risks that you identified. So let's imagine you've had your brainstorm and you've got a list of 20 potential risks for your event. You need to work through each one of those risks and put them through this little formula. And essentially what you're doing is you're working out the likelihood of that risk happening and the consequence if it did happen. And that's going to give you a level for each of your risks. So you can see there on the screen, the level of risk is consequence times likelihood. The reason we do this, it's not because we just like to have pretty charts. It's because it allows us to identify what risks need the most attention and what action do we need to take on each risk. So you start to move from a big long list of 20 potential risks to a series of categorized risks, which will be low risk, medium risk, high risk, or very high risk. So just to give you an example, you know, looking at this particular matrix, a fire, let's just say a bushfire, it may be unlikely, but if it did happen, it would have major consequences. So that means it's, if we look at that formula, consequence times likelihood, that means it's unlikely times major, which makes it a medium risk. So pretty simple, right? So you just need to go through all of those risks that you've identified and put them through that formula. Once we've done that and you've got your categories, you're then better placed to start thinking about how to manage and handle each of those risks and what actions you need to take to mitigate them. So we have low risks, which mean monitor and manage with routine procedure. If it's a medium risk, we develop and implement a mitigation action plan. If it's a high risk, we consider an alternative activity unless you can put appropriate controls in place. If it gets to very high, then that needs immediate action. That's not acceptable. You don't want a very high risk going into your event. You want to get that one out of there. Sorry, just a couple of people popping in and out, so I'm just having to let them in. So distraction. So like I said, once you've got your full list, you've categorized them from low to very high, then you can start to look at, well, what's the necessary action we need to take to mitigate them? And it also means that, now my husband's trying to call, gosh, sorry. It also means that you can identify where you need to put the most resources to manage certain risks. What we'll end up getting to is a point where you'll have risks that can't be mitigated. You might have a high risk and you really look at that risk and go, we can't mitigate that. So what you need to think about there is the emergency management plan or an incident response plan. So then you start to go, okay, if it does happen, so we can't mitigate it altogether, it's still a likely risk. It's not guaranteed to happen, but it's a potential. So we need to think about what our emergency or our incident management plan will be. And that's what we're going to look at next week when we look at emergency management planning. Essentially, those risks that we cannot mitigate altogether need to be considered as part of an emergency management plan so that you know how you're going to respond if it does happen at the event. So you can see what happens is you get the low and medium, and you can usually mitigate those. You can usually put in place things that actually mitigate them altogether, or at least highly likely to mitigate them. But the high and the very high tend to be those that, you know, you can't always mitigate them. So it could be things outside of your control. So bushfires, floods, terrorism, COVID-19. So you need to be able to think about emergency management plans with that. And this is another tool. You'll see this in your template that you're provided. And essentially this is also looking at, well, what is that hierarchy of controls? So depending on the category of the risk will determine what controls you put in place for that risk. And, you know, some of the risk may require more than one control. So if you've got an extreme heat day, then that might require, you know, engineering controls. So, you know, isolating people from the hazard, having shade and, you know, misty water areas to get them out of that area. It may need administrative controls. It may need PPE, also to minimise the risk of any illness or injury. So that can be, I mean, PPE is like hats, protective equipment as well from those serious heat conditions. And now, just to wrap up before we go into discussion time, the last thing I want to talk about is contingency planning. This is a key aspect of risk management planning. And this is really about going, what are the things that can go wrong on event day? So you're looking at risk management as how do we remove the likelihood of those risks happening? But then there's those things that are likely to happen, sorry, not likely to happen, that could happen, that you need to be prepared for. We hope that they don't happen, but it's always good to have that plan B. And nobody likes to be negative, and this can be a hard process when we have to think about all those things that could go wrong on event day. But once again, like I said earlier, if you think it through and you know, okay, we've addressed that, we know if there's a code red day or there's a fire or whatever, this is our process. It's essentially a plan B for when things don't go as planned. And it just means that everybody in your team is clear on how to respond, and so that you can rectify the situation as quickly and as smoothly as possible. So what are some of these things that could go wrong? These are things like, you know, weather. It's an obvious one. It's such a challenge for us working in events, particularly in outdoors. You know, sometimes we're just crossing our fingers and toes for a sunny weekend for our event. But sometimes we don't get it and it could be raining. So that's thinking about, if that happens, what will you do? Where will you relocate your event to? Can it just go ahead in wet weather? An event I worked in, which was on a farm, they basically said our wet weather contingency plan is we go ahead no matter what. And our communications becomes, you know, when we work on farms, we have to work in all weather conditions. So wear your gumboots, bring an umbrella, wear your dry as a bone, and come and enjoy our festival. That was their plan. So they addressed it. They knew that if it was going to be wet, they go ahead no matter what, and they adjust their communication so that people still feel comfortable coming on the farm during that weather. You've also got things like bushfires or code red days. You know, what's your contingency plan if that happens? Do you have to cancel? Do you have to postpone in that case? What if you have lower than expected ticket sales? Can you drum up an audience, or can you move to a smaller event space so it doesn't look like it's not full? There's nothing worse than if you've got a speaker or an artist and they're, you know, staring out to a sea of empty seats. If you're working in a regional landscape, things like loss of power. You know, what happens if power goes down? What happens if you don't have internet or AV? Do you need backup generators? What if there's broken or blocked toilets? Heaven forbid, but it happens a lot. And it's not a good user experience. If you're an attendee at an event and the toilets are all blocked and disgusting, it's not nice. So how do you manage that? Do you have an emergency plumber that's on call during your event? What's your plan around that? And then there can be things, and we're seeing more and more of these happen, particularly if you're an event that has animals, but things like protests or roadblocks outside your event, you know, things that can actually prevent access to your venue and also have a negative, you know, image for your event. How do you deal with that? So contingency planning is thinking about what could go wrong and how would you do it? What's your plan B? Okay, that's everything I have to share in terms of risk management. As I said, next week we're going to talk about emergency management planning. So that's essentially, I guess it's a bit of an extension on contingency planning. Kind of all of these things work together, and risk management planning, contingency planning, emergency management planning. Essentially, emergency management is really about those things that are an emergency. So if it becomes a crisis or an emergency where evacuation is required or things extreme like that, we need to have in place controls around how we manage that. Not only the who and the how, but also the communication around that to protect our reputation as well. I'm just jumping into the chat box to see what everybody's noted and if there's any questions. If anybody has any questions while I'm having a quick look in here, please pop it into the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question or raise any points you'd like. Bad weather, yeah. Ross, you've said event security is a risk, or do you mean event security? Is that a risk because of the cost, the increasing cost of event security? I'm thinking that might be what it is, because that's a challenge for a lot of events.
Well, in two things, yes, the increasing cost of security is one, but also ensuring you have enough. So if you have issues with perhaps people who wish to misbehave, turn up drunk, do whatever else, you might need to make sure you've got enough security available to deal with them while also managing the event.
Yes. And to answer your last question, Ross, yeah, very high, extreme, definitely the same category. Okay, so there's plenty of bad weather mentions in there. There's only one COVID mention. Obviously, that's a risk for all of us under the current environment, but hopefully there'll be measures in place for us to handle those by next year. Human resource, Mark has mentioned, ageing volunteers, that's an ongoing risk for a lot of events. Yeah, that's a good one, Ross, third-party providers and their standards. And once again, and we talked about this, I can't remember which session, the event management plan, I think it was. You know, I talked about the responsibility around insurance and, you know, managing third-party providers. It's the same thing in terms of quality of service and standards. You want to make sure that you manage that. And I mentioned it before, you know, there's a risk around what happens if you get, let's say, a celebrity chef for a guest speaker that somebody's referred them on, thought, oh yeah, great, you get them, don't perhaps do enough research, and they turn out to be a really bad presenter. They might be a good chef, but they're not really good at presenting. That can be a risk as well. Lack of volunteers overall. is the biggest challenge. Absolutely. Anyone got any other questions or points they would like to raise, whether it's about risk management planning or anything else related to events at this stage? Excellent. Well, we might call it a day. Thank you all so much for joining us. I'll see you next week. Next week, we will look at what are we looking at next week now? Emergency management planning. And then also next week, we'll look at marketing and social media. So another couple of great topics. So I look forward to seeing you all on Monday. Thanks again. Have a lovely week.
Good on,
Bye.
see ya.